My mother-in-law demanded a paternity test at the baptism of my daughter. Her jaw dropped when I gave her exactly what she asked for. My mother-in-law Brenda convinced herself that her son Paul couldn't possibly be the father of our daughter because the baby had blue eyes and dimples which nobody in their immediate family had. She started this campaign the day Lily was born. When she walked into the delivery room, took one look at the baby and said, "That's not Paul's child. I know my son's genetics." Paul was standing right there holding my hand, still in shock from becoming a father, and his mother was already denying his daughter. From that day forward, Brenda refused to acknowledge Lily as her granddaughter. She'd refer to her as your baby, when talking to me, never my granddaughter, or even Lily. When people asked about her grandchildren, she'd only mention Paul's sister's kids and pretend Lily didn't exist. If someone specifically asked about our baby, she'd say, "Well, Amanda has a baby, but we're still determining the particulars." Like paternity was some mystery that needed solving, she started telling everyone in their family that I'd trapped Paul with someone else's baby. She'd call relatives and whisper about how the timing was suspicious, and the baby looked nothing like Paul. She'd point out that Lily had blue eyes when both Paul and I had brown, completely ignoring that Paul's father had blue eyes, and genetics can skip generations. At family gatherings, she'd hold her other grandchildren but refuse to even look at Lily. When I'd try to hand her the baby, she'd step back and say, "I don't feel comfortable until we know for sure." Paul would beg her to stop, but she'd respond with, "If you're so certain, then prove it. Real fathers don't fear the truth." She'd leave pamphlets for paternity testing centers on our doorstep. She'd send Paul articles about men raising children that weren't theirs. She created this whole timeline about a work conference I'd attended trying to prove I'd cheated, even though Paul had been with me the entire trip. The worst part was how she'd act concerned, like she was protecting Paul. "I just want what's best for my son," she'd say. A mother knows when something isn't right. She'd touch Paul's arm and say, "You can tell me the truth, honey. Did you have doubts? It's okay to admit she fooled you." Paul kept telling her to stop, but she'd twist it into me manipulating him. The breaking point came when Brenda started planning Lily's baptism without telling us. She called the church and scheduled it specifically so she could stand up during the ceremony and demand a paternity test in front of the congregation. We showed up prepared. The church was packed with Brenda's friends and family, all waiting for her big moment. The priest started the ceremony, and right on cue, Brenda stood up. "I object to this baptism," she announced. "This child isn't my son's baby, and I demand a paternity test before this sacred ceremony continues." The church went silent. Brenda pulled out a folder and continued, "I have evidence that this child can't be Paul's. The eyes, the dimples, the chin, nothing matches our family." She turned to the congregation. "Would God want us to baptize a child under false pretenses?" That's when my father stood up. He'd been silent for months watching Brenda torture us, but he'd had enough. "Brenda, you want to talk about genetics? Let's talk about genetics." He pulled out his phone and showed a photo. It was Paul's father in his 20s holding baby Paul. Paul's father had bright blue eyes and deep dimples exactly like Lily. "Your husband had blue eyes, Brenda. You've been married to a blue-eyed man for 35 years. Did you forget?" Brenda went pale, but my father wasn't done. "Here's Paul's grandmother, Dorothy. Look at those dimples. Here's Paul's great-uncle James with the same chin you claim doesn't exist in your family." He kept showing photo after photo from Paul's own family albums that Brenda had somehow ignored. Paul's Aunt Helen stood up next. "Brenda, you know damn well those features run in our family. My daughter has the same dimples. Are you questioning her paternity too?" The priest looked horrified and asked if we wanted to continue. The congregation started murmuring. The priest stepped forward. "I think we need to pause this baptism. Brenda, please leave my church." Brenda stood alone in the middle of the empty church aisle, clutching her folder against her chest, like it could somehow protect her from what just happened. People filed out through the main doors, whispering to each other and glancing back at her with looks that ranged from pity to disgust. Paul's hand squeezed mine so tight I could feel his wedding ring pressing into my palm, and when I looked up at him, his eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying yet. Helen walked over and put her hand on Paul's shoulder without saying anything, because what could anyone say after that? I shifted Lily in my arms and she started fussing louder, probably picking up on all the stress in the room. The priest Grace stood near the altar watching Brenda with this mix of concern and disappointment on her face, like she couldn't believe someone would do that in her church. My father gathered up his phone and the old photo albums he'd brought and came over to check on us. Helen leaned in close and whispered that we should take our time and not worry about anything else right now. Paul's aunt had tears in her eyes when she looked at Lily, and she reached out to touch the baby's little hand. Brenda finally moved and walked toward the side exit instead of the main doors, like she couldn't face going past everyone who'd just watched her get called out. The church kept emptying until it was just us and Grace and a few stragglers who seemed unsure whether to approach us or leave. Grace walked over with her hands clasped in front of her, looking genuinely sorry about the whole thing. She asked quietly if we wanted to continue with just family there, but her voice was gentle, like she already knew the answer. I shook my head because I was shaking all over and Lily was crying harder now and I just needed to get out of there. Paul said we should reschedule and Grace nodded and said she'd make sure we got a better day next week when things were calmer. We thanked her and headed for the side door, the same one Brenda had gone through, but she was already gone by the time we got outside. The parking lot was half empty, and people were standing in little groups talking, and I could feel them watching us as we walked to our car. My father offered to come back to our house, but I told him we needed some time alone as a family first. He hugged me tight and kissed Lily's forehead, and told Paul to call him if we needed anything at all. Helen said the same thing and gave Paul her phone number even though he already had it so he knew she was there. We buckled Lily into her car seat and she was still crying, and I felt this wave of guilt that her baptism day had turned into such a nightmare. Paul drove home in silence with his jaw clenched and his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I tried to comfort Lily from the front seat, but she wouldn't calm down, and I didn't blame her because I wanted to scream too. When we pulled into our driveway, I saw Hugo's car already parked on the street and my stomach dropped because I didn't know if I could handle another confrontation. But when Hugo got out of his car, he looked broken, like someone had knocked all the fight out of him. He walked up to us before we even got Lily out of the car and started apologizing before Paul could say anything. Hugo's voice cracked when he said he should have spoken up months ago when Brenda first started this whole thing. He followed us inside and sat down on our couch with his head in his hands and kept saying he was sorry over and over. Paul stood there holding Lily and didn't say anything, and I could see him trying to process that his father was actually here taking our side. Hugo explained that he'd been trying to talk sense into Brenda privately for months, telling her she was wrong about the genetics and wrong about me. He said she wouldn't listen and kept finding new reasons to doubt, and he didn't know how to get through to her. The breaking point for him was watching her stand up in church and humiliate us in front of everyone. Hugo looked up at Paul with red eyes and said no wife of his was going to treat his son and granddaughter that way. He asked if he could hold Lily, and Paul hesitated for just a second before handing her over. Hugo cradled her close and talked to her in this soft voice, telling her she was beautiful and perfect, and he was so sorry for everything. I sat down next to Paul on the love seat and took his hand, because I could feel him starting to shake. Paul finally spoke and his voice came out rough, asking his father where he was going to stay because he obviously couldn't go home. Hugo said he'd figure something out, maybe a hotel for now until he decided what to do about his marriage. The word marriage hung in the air heavy and terrible because we all knew what it meant. Paul put his head in his hands, just like his father had done, and I watched his shoulders start to shake. I moved closer and wrapped my arm around him and he leaned into me and just let it out. Hugo kept rocking Lily and she finally started to calm down in her grandfather's arms. I told Paul we needed to talk about what happens next with his mother, and he nodded but didn't lift his head. Hugo said he'd give us space and started to stand up, but Paul told him to stay because we were all in this together now. So we sat there in our living room, the three of us and Lily, and tried to figure out how to move forward. Paul said he didn't know if he could ever forgive his mother for what she did, and I squeezed his hand because I didn't know either. Hugo said Brenda would need to take real responsibility and make real changes before any of us should even consider letting her back into our lives. The conversation went in circles for a while because there were no easy answers and everyone was exhausted. My phone started buzzing in my purse and I pulled it out to see messages flooding in from family members. Most of them were from people who'd been at the church saying they couldn't believe what they'd witnessed and asking if we were okay. A few were more detailed, talking about how they'd always known Brenda was controlling but never imagined she'd go this far. I showed some of the messages to Paul and he read them with this blank expression like he couldn't process any more emotion. Then Gabriella's name popped up on my screen and I answered because she was Paul's sister, and she deserved to know we were okay. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first, and she kept apologizing for not knowing what their mother had been saying about me. Gabriella said Brenda had mentioned some concerns about Lily's paternity, but made it sound like normal grandmother worry, not a full campaign of lies. She was ashamed she hadn't questioned it or asked me directly, and now she felt like she'd failed us. I told her it wasn't her fault, and that Brenda had been careful about who she told what and how she framed things. Gabriella asked if she could come over, but I said we needed some time and maybe tomorrow would be better. She understood and said she loved us and supported us completely and would do whatever we needed. After I hung up, Paul asked what she'd said and I gave him the summary. He looked relieved that at least his sister was on our side even if his mother wasn't. Hugo checked his watch and said he should probably find a hotel room before it got too late. Paul told him to stay in the guest room and Hugo looked surprised but grateful. That evening felt strange and quiet after all the chaos of the church. We ordered pizza because none of us had the energy to cook, and we ate in the living room with the TV on low. Lily fell asleep in her bouncer and I kept checking on her like something might happen if I looked away. Paul's phone started ringing around 7, and when he looked at the screen, his whole body went tense. It was Brenda calling, and he let it go to voicemail. She called back immediately, and he ignored it again. Then again and again until he finally turned his phone face down on the coffee table. Hugo shook his head and said she'd probably keep trying until she got through or gave up. The voicemail notification popped up, and Paul stared at it for a long time before picking up his phone. He put it on speaker so we could all hear, and Brenda's voice came through sharp and angry. She said we'd embarrassed her in front of the entire church and made her look like a fool in front of all her friends. She demanded we apologize and said we'd turned everyone against her with lies and manipulation. There was no acknowledgement that she'd been wrong. No apology for what she'd put us through, just anger that we'd humiliated her. The voicemail ended, and the three of us sat there in silence. I watched Paul's face change from hurt to something harder, something I'd never seen before. He picked up his phone and started typing, and I could see his jaw working as he chose his words carefully. When he was done, he showed me the message before sending it. It said we wouldn't be in contact until she genuinely apologized and acknowledged what she'd done to our family. Short and clear and final. He hit send and put his phone back down, and I saw his hands were shaking. Hugo said that was the right thing to do and that Brenda needed to face consequences for her actions. We tried to watch a movie, but none of us could focus, and eventually Hugo went to bed in the guest room. Paul and I stayed up talking in whispers so we wouldn't wake Lily. He said he kept replaying the church scene in his head, seeing his mother stand up and accuse me in front of everyone. I told him I was just glad it was over and people finally saw the truth. But it didn't feel over because Brenda was still out there, still convinced she was right, still angry at us. We went to bed around midnight, but I don't think either of us really slept. The next morning, Hugo's phone rang early, and he answered it in the kitchen while Paul and I were feeding Lily. We could hear his voice getting louder and more frustrated, and when he came back into the living room, his face was red. He said Brenda was furious and claiming we'd all turned against her with lies, and that she was the real victim. She'd told him he was betraying his wife by staying with us, and demanded he come home immediately. Hugo had told her he was staying at Helen's house, which was a lie, but he didn't want her showing up here. He said the tension was so bad he couldn't imagine going back, and Brenda was refusing to admit she'd done anything wrong. She kept insisting she had legitimate concerns, and that we'd blown everything out of proportion. Paul asked if his mother had said anything about apologizing, and Hugo just shook his head. That afternoon, Paul and I sat down at the kitchen table and had the conversation we'd been avoiding. We talked about boundaries and what reconciliation would even look like if it ever happened. Paul said any relationship with his mother would have to involve her acknowledging the harm she caused, not just to us, but to Lily. I agreed and added that she'd need to accept Lily as her granddaughter without conditions or doubts. We made a list of what real accountability would look like, and it felt good to have something concrete even if we didn't think Brenda would ever meet those standards. My father called later that day to check on us, and I could hear the anger still in his voice from yesterday. He said he'd been holding back for months watching Brenda torture us and trying to be diplomatic, but her stunt at the baptism was beyond anything he could tolerate. He told me he was proud of how we'd handled ourselves with dignity, while Brenda showed her true character to everyone who mattered. I thanked him for standing up for us, and he said he'd do it again in a heartbeat. After we hung up, I felt this weird sense of relief mixed with sadness, because our family would never be the same. Paul came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, and we just stood there for a while watching Lily sleep in her crib. He said we'd get through this together, and I believed him because we'd already survived the worst of it. 3 days passed with me jumping every time my phone buzzed, and Paul checking the front door like he expected something bad to arrive. On Tuesday morning, Hugo showed up at our house holding a white envelope and looking tired. He handed it to Paul without saying much and sat down at our kitchen table while I poured him coffee. Paul stared at the envelope like it might explode, then finally opened it and pulled out 3 pages of Brenda's handwriting. He started reading out loud, and his voice got shakier with every sentence. Brenda had written this long explanation about how she only wanted to protect Paul from being tricked, and how any good mother would have the same concerns about a baby that didn't look like her son. She listed all the reasons she thought Lily's features were suspicious, and said we should understand why she felt she had to speak up at the baptism. She wrote about how hurt she was that we embarrassed her in front of the whole church, and made her look like the bad person when she was just trying to help. Not once did she say she was wrong or apologize for spreading lies about me for months. Paul got to the end, and his hands were shaking so bad the pages rattled. He ripped the letter in half, then kept tearing it into smaller and smaller pieces while I watched. He told me he was done trying to make his mother see reason, until she took real responsibility for what she did to our family. Hugo nodded and said that was probably the only way Brenda would ever understand how serious this was. The torn pieces of letter sat in a pile on our table, and none of us moved to clean them up. Helen called that afternoon and invited us to Sunday dinner at her house with some family members who wanted to show support. When we arrived, her dining room was packed with people including Paul's cousins and their spouses, and a few aunts and uncles I'd only met a couple times. Everyone made a point to hold Lily and tell us how beautiful she was, and how obvious it was that she had Paul's father's eyes. We sat down to eat, and the conversation stayed light for a while, until one of Paul's cousins mentioned how relieved everyone was that Brenda finally showed her true colors in public. That opened the floodgates, and people started sharing stories about things Brenda had done over the years. Paul's uncle talked about how Brenda tried to stop him from marrying his wife because she wasn't the right kind of Catholic. One cousin shared that Brenda refused to come to her wedding because she didn't approve of the venue. Another relative mentioned how Brenda had spread rumors about Paul's aunt getting plastic surgery when really she'd just lost weight. I sat there holding my fork and realized this pattern went back decades and everyone had just been making excuses for it or staying quiet to keep the peace. Paul looked stunned, like he was seeing his mother's behavior in a completely new way. Helen squeezed my hand across the table and said she was sorry she didn't stand up to Brenda sooner, but watching her attack me and Lily at the baptism made her realize silence was the same as approval. After dinner, Paul went outside to get some air and his childhood friend Bryson followed him out. I watched through the window as they talked on the back porch, and I could see Paul's shoulders shaking. They came back inside 20 minutes later and Bryson pulled me aside to apologize. He said he'd witnessed the whole baptism scene from the back of the church, and it made him realize how toxic Brenda had always been even when they were kids. He admitted Paul had told him months ago about his mother's accusations, and he'd just brushed it off as family drama instead of taking it seriously. He felt terrible that he hadn't spoken up or supported Paul when it first started. I told him it meant a lot that he was here now, and he hugged me and said he'd make sure everyone in their friend group knew the truth about what Brenda had done. We spent the next few days making calls to reschedule Lily's baptism for the following weekend. Grace was incredibly kind about the whole situation and offered to do a small private ceremony at the church on Saturday morning. We made a list of people to invite and kept it short, just immediate family and close friends who had stood by us through everything. The morning of the baptism, I dressed Lily in the same white gown we'd bought for the original ceremony and felt this weird mix of sadness and relief. Sad that it had to happen this way, but relieved that we'd be surrounded by people who genuinely loved our daughter. The church was quiet, with maybe 15 people scattered in the front pews. Grace started the ceremony, and I held Lily close, feeling her warm weight against my chest. Hugo stood next to us as godfather, and when Grace asked him to make his promises, his voice cracked with emotion. The whole ceremony felt peaceful and meaningful in a way the original one never could have been. No one was waiting for drama or watching to see what would happen. Everyone there just wanted to celebrate our baby girl. When it was over, people hugged us and took photos, and we went to Helen's house for lunch. I kept thinking about how Brenda's absence made everything better, and that thought didn't even make me feel guilty anymore. 2 weeks after the church incident, Gabriella called crying and asked if she could come over. She showed up an hour later and told us Brenda had been calling extended family members, trying to convince them that we'd set up the whole baptism confrontation to make her look bad on purpose. She was telling people we'd coached my father on what to say and planted those family photos to embarrass her. Most people weren't buying it, according to Gabriella, but a few distant relatives who didn't know us well seemed sympathetic to Brenda's version of events. Gabriella felt caught in the middle because she loved her mother, but couldn't defend what Brenda had done. Paul told her she didn't have to choose sides, and we understood this was complicated for her. I appreciated that he said it, but part of me wanted Gabriella to choose us more firmly instead of trying to stay neutral. After she left, I felt exhausted from the ongoing drama and wished Brenda would just accept what happened and move on. Janelle came over the next day with coffee and pastries and made me sit down and talk through everything. She'd been my best friend since college and knew me well enough to see I was struggling, even though I kept saying I was fine. She pointed out that Brenda's refusal to apologize was actually making our decision easier, because we didn't have to feel guilty about keeping our distance from someone who wouldn't admit they did anything wrong. That hit me hard because I'd been carrying around this low-level guilt about cutting Paul's mother out of Lily's life. Janelle reminded me that we'd given Brenda so many chances to stop her campaign against us, and she'd chosen to escalate instead. She said the baptism scene was just Brenda showing everyone who she really was, and we should be grateful it happened in public, so people couldn't pretend we were overreacting. By the time Janelle left, I felt lighter, like someone had given me permission to stop feeling bad about protecting my family. Paul started having trouble sleeping around this time. I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and find him sitting in Lily's room watching her sleep, or downstairs staring at nothing. One night I sat next to him on the couch, and he finally admitted he was grieving the mother he wished he had versus accepting who she actually was. He said he kept thinking about moments from his childhood when Brenda had been controlling or manipulative and wondering why he never saw the pattern before. I suggested he talk to a therapist to work through everything because this was too big to handle alone. He agreed and started researching counselors who specialized in family conflict and boundary setting. 3 weeks after the baptism, Hugo showed up at our door looking serious. He asked if we could talk privately, and Paul and I sat down with him in the living room while Lily napped. Hugo said he'd filed for legal separation from Brenda that morning. He explained that watching her attack his granddaughter and daughter-in-law without any remorse made him realize he couldn't stay married to someone so mean and delusional. He'd been thinking about leaving for years but always talked himself out of it for the sake of keeping the family together. The baptism was his breaking point because he saw how Brenda's behavior was poisoning the next generation, and he refused to be part of it anymore. Paul looked shocked and asked if his father was sure, and Hugo said he'd never been more certain of anything in his life. He told us he planned to be the grandfather Lily deserved, and he was sorry it took him so long to stand up to his wife. I started crying and thanked him for choosing us, and he hugged me tight and said we were his family too. 2 days after Hugo moved to Helen's place, my phone rang while I was changing Lily's diaper. Paul's name showed up on the screen, but when I answered, I heard Brenda's voice instead, high and shaking with anger. She'd taken Paul's phone from the counter at our house when she came by earlier that morning while I was at the grocery store. Paul grabbed it from her hand and put her on speaker, so I could hear everything. She was screaming about how I'd destroyed her marriage and turned her whole family against her like some kind of witch who'd cast a spell on everyone. Paul stayed completely calm and told her that Hugo left because of her own behavior, not because anyone forced him to do anything. She kept talking over him, saying I'd manipulated Hugo just like I'd trapped Paul with someone else's baby, and now her husband was gone and her son wouldn't talk to her and it was all my fault. Paul waited for her to take a breath and then said very clearly that she'd spent months accusing his wife of cheating and denying his daughter existed and demanding paternity tests in front of entire congregations full of people. He told her those were her choices and her actions, and she needed to accept responsibility for the consequences instead of blaming everyone else. Brenda started crying and saying she was just trying to protect him, and he was being cruel and heartless. Paul said he had to go and hung up while she was still talking. He looked exhausted when he got home and told me she'd shown up at our door demanding to be let inside, so she could talk to him alone without me there to control what he said. He'd stood in the doorway and told her he wouldn't have any private conversations that excluded me, because we were a team, and she needed to understand that. She'd pushed past him anyway and grabbed his phone off the kitchen counter before he could stop her. The next week, I ran into someone from Brenda's church at the pharmacy. The woman was maybe 60 with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she gave me this cold look while we were both waiting for prescriptions. She walked over and said she'd heard I was keeping Lily away from her grandmother out of pure spite. I asked who told her that, and she said Brenda had been at their prayer group talking about how heartbroken she was that I wouldn't let her see her granddaughter. The woman said Brenda cried the whole time, telling everyone how she'd tried so hard to be part of Lily's life, but I'd turned Paul against his own mother. I felt my face get hot because Brenda was literally rewriting everything that happened to make herself look like the victim. I told the woman that Brenda demanded a paternity test at my daughter's baptism in front of the whole church and accused me of trapping her son with someone else's baby. The woman's expression changed a little, but she said maybe Brenda just had concerns and I was being too sensitive. I picked up my prescription and left before I said something I'd regret. When I got home, I told Paul about it and he could see how angry I was. The lies made me want to scream because Brenda was telling people this completely false version where she was the poor, was rejected grandmother, instead of the woman who'd spent months tormenting us and publicly humiliating our family. That night, Paul and I sat on the couch after Lily went to sleep and talked about whether we should tell people the real story. Part of me wanted to post everything on social media or send a group message to everyone in Brenda's church explaining exactly what she'd done. Paul said the people who really mattered already knew the truth because they'd either been at the baptism or heard about it from family members who were there. He pointed out that strangers who believed Brenda's lies without asking our side weren't people whose opinions should matter to us anyway. I knew he was right, but it still felt wrong to let her spread those stories without defending ourselves. Paul reminded me that we'd spent months trying to reason with Brenda and show her the truth, and she'd only escalated instead of listening. He said engaging with her false narrative would just give her more attention and make us look defensive when we hadn't done anything wrong. We decided to let it go and focus on the people who actually supported us, instead of wasting energy on Brenda's church friends who wanted to believe her version. 3 days later, Helen called and said she was organizing a family party to celebrate Lily's baptism the right way with everyone who'd stood by us. She wanted to make it clear that our real family was the people who chose to support us instead of believing Brenda's lies. She'd already talked to Hugo and Gabriella and my father and a bunch of other relatives who'd been at the church that day. The party would be at her house the following Saturday, and she was handling all the food and decorations. I felt emotional hearing her take charge like that because it meant so much to have Paul's aunt actively working to bring everyone together. Paul thanked her and said it was exactly what we needed after weeks of dealing with Brenda's drama. Helen said she'd watched Brenda control and manipulate her family for 30 years, and the baptism incident was the final straw for a lot of people who'd been making excuses for her behavior. She wanted us to know we had a whole group of family members who genuinely loved us and Lily, and wouldn't let Brenda's poison affect our lives anymore. Saturday came and we drove to Helen's house with Lily in her car seat. The driveway was already packed with cars, and when we walked inside, there were maybe 20 people there, including Hugo and Gabriella and my father and Paul's cousins, and several aunts and uncles. Helen had set up a beautiful table with a cake that said, "Welcome to the family, Lily," and there were balloons and flowers everywhere. Everyone wanted to hold Lily and take pictures with her, and it felt like the baptism celebration we should have had in the first place. Hugo was holding Lily near the fireplace when Helen asked everyone to gather around. He cleared his throat and started talking about how becoming a grandfather had taught him what really mattered in life. He said he'd spent too many years making excuses for behavior that hurt people he loved, and watching Brenda attack his granddaughter at her baptism made him realize he couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. His voice got thick, and he looked right at Paul and said he was grateful his son had the strength to protect his daughter from toxicity, even when it meant standing up to his own mother. He said Paul was a better father than he'd been, and he was proud to be Lily's grandfather. Several people started crying, including Gabriella and Paul's cousin Maria. Paul had tears running down his face, and I squeezed his hand tight. Hugo handed Lily to me and hugged Paul for a long time. The whole room felt charged with emotion because everyone there had made a choice to be part of our family instead of staying neutral or siding with Brenda. 4 weeks went by and life started feeling more normal without Brenda's constant drama. Then Paul's phone dinged with an email notification while we were eating dinner. He opened it and his face changed as he read. It was from Brenda, and it went on for paragraphs about all the ways she'd been a good mother to Paul and Gabriella when they were growing up. She listed specific memories like taking them to the park and helping with homework and attending every school event. Then she wrote about how she'd been an amazing grandmother to Gabriella's kids, never missing a birthday or holiday, and always being there when Gabriella needed help. The whole email was designed to make us feel like we were being unreasonable by keeping her away from Lily when she'd proven herself as a mother and grandmother. But nowhere in those long paragraphs did she apologize for anything she'd done. She didn't mention demanding the paternity test, or accusing me of cheating or refusing to acknowledge Lily for months. She just acted like we were punishing her for no reason when she'd always been such a devoted family member. Paul read the email twice and then started typing a response. He wrote that he appreciated everything she'd done for him growing up, but that didn't erase what she'd done to our family. He laid out exactly what would need to happen before any relationship could resume. First, she needed to genuinely apologize and admit she was wrong to accuse me of infidelity and demand a paternity test. Second, she needed to acknowledge that she'd spread lies about Lily's paternity to extended family and friends. Third, she needed to commit to seeing a therapist to work on her controlling behavior and inability to respect boundaries. He made it clear these weren't negotiable conditions, and we weren't interested in halfway apologies or excuses. He said he loved her, but protecting his daughter came first, and until she could take real accountability, there was nothing to discuss. He read it to me before sending, and I told him it was perfect, because it gave her a clear path forward while also making our standards obvious. He hit send, and we both knew she probably wouldn't respond well, but at least we'd been completely honest about what we needed. The next day, my father stopped by while Paul was at work. He sat at our kitchen table drinking coffee while Lily played on her mat nearby. He said he'd been thinking about everything with Brenda, and he wanted to suggest something. He thought Paul and I should meet with a family therapist who specialized in dealing with toxic family dynamics and setting boundaries. He'd done some research and found someone named Ingrid Boyd, who had great reviews and experience with situations like ours. My father said even though we'd been handling everything well, it might help to have professional guidance for maintaining boundaries and dealing with potential future contact from Brenda. He also thought it would be good to have strategies ready in case Brenda escalated or tried new tactics to force her way back into our lives. I told him I thought it was a smart idea, and I'd talk to Paul about it. When Paul got home that evening, I mentioned what my father had suggested, and he immediately agreed. He said he'd been feeling like we were making decisions on instinct, but it would be better to have expert advice about how to protect our family long-term. We looked up Ingrid Boyd together and read through her website. She had a whole section about narcissistic family members and adult children setting boundaries with toxic parents. Paul called and left a message, and she got back to us the next morning with an appointment time for the following week. The day of our first therapy session, we dropped Lily off with my father and drove to Ingrid's office. She was maybe 50 with kind eyes and a calm way of speaking that immediately put me at ease. We sat on a comfortable couch in her office, and she asked us to tell her what brought us in. Paul and I took turns explaining everything from Lily's birth through the baptism incident and Hugo's separation and Brenda's recent email. Ingrid listened without interrupting and took a few notes. When we finished, she said what we'd described showed clear signs of narcissistic personality traits, including the inability to take responsibility, the victim mentality, and the pattern of manipulation. She explained that people with these traits often can't genuinely apologize because admitting they were wrong threatens their self-image. She said Brenda's email listing all her good qualities was typical because narcissistic people focus on their positive actions to avoid acknowledging their harmful behavior. Ingrid told us the boundaries we'd set were not only healthy, but necessary for protecting our family. She said we shouldn't feel guilty about limiting contact, because we'd given Brenda multiple chances to change, and she'd chosen to escalate instead. Hearing a professional validate our decisions made me feel lighter, like I'd been carrying around unnecessary guilt. Paul asked if there was any chance Brenda would ever genuinely change, and Ingrid said it was possible, but unlikely without intensive therapy that Brenda would have to choose for herself. She said our job wasn't to fix Brenda, but to protect ourselves and our daughter from ongoing harm. 2 days after our therapy session, Gabriella called sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. I put her on speaker so Paul could hear and asked her to slow down and tell us what happened. She said Brenda had shown up at her house that afternoon without warning, and demanded to know why her own daughter was siding with me over her. Gabriella had been home alone with her kids, and Brenda pushed her way inside and started yelling about how the whole family had turned against her. She kept asking Gabriella how she could betray her own mother by supporting Paul and me. Gabriella tried to explain that she wasn't choosing sides, but that she couldn't defend what Brenda had done at the baptism. Brenda got angrier and said Gabriella was weak and easily manipulated just like Paul. She said horrible things about me and called Gabriella a bad daughter for not standing up for her family. Gabriella finally had to ask her to leave, and Brenda stormed out saying she'd lost both her children to my lies. Now Gabriella was questioning everything, and wondering if she should have tried harder to maintain a relationship with their mother, despite what happened. Paul talked to her for almost an hour, reassuring her that she'd done nothing wrong, and that she was allowed to have whatever relationship she wanted with Brenda, without our judgment. He told her that protecting herself and her kids from Brenda's anger was the right choice. Gabriella kept crying and saying she felt guilty for not being able to fix things between Brenda and the rest of the family. I could hear the pain in her voice, and I felt terrible that Brenda's behavior was hurting her daughter too. I told Paul he'd done everything he could and Gabriella was going through her own process of accepting who Brenda really was. He sat on the couch with his head back and closed his eyes for a minute before he said his sister felt guilty about all the times she defended their mother or made excuses for her behavior. I sat next to him and said Gabriella was allowed to process this at her own pace, and we weren't going to pressure her to cut off contact with Brenda if she wasn't ready. Paul nodded and said he'd made that clear to her, but she kept apologizing for not seeing the truth sooner. He talked to Gabriella for another 40 minutes while I fed Lily and got her ready for bed. I could hear him through the baby monitor telling his sister that she wasn't responsible for fixing their mother, and that protecting herself and her kids came first. When he finally hung up, he looked exhausted and said Gabriella admitted she'd spent her whole life making excuses for Brenda's controlling behavior, and this incident with the baptism opened her eyes to patterns she'd been ignoring. I asked if Gabriella was okay, and Paul said she would be, but she needed time to work through 30 years of conditioning. He said his sister kept crying and saying she felt like she'd failed us by not standing up to their mother earlier. I reminded Paul that Gabriella had her own relationship with Brenda separate from ours, and she shouldn't feel guilty about that. 6 weeks passed, and I was at the grocery store picking up formula and diapers when I turned down the cereal aisle and nearly ran my cart into one of Brenda's friends from church. The woman looked at me with this cold expression and stopped her cart right in front of mine so I couldn't get past. She said I should be ashamed of myself for what I'd done to Brenda, and that I'd destroyed a good woman's life with my lies and manipulation. I felt my face get hot, but I kept my voice calm and said, Brenda destroyed her own relationships when she stood up at her granddaughter's baptism and demanded a paternity test in front of the entire congregation. The woman's mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but I pushed my cart around hers and walked away before she could say anything else. My hands were shaking when I got to the checkout line, and I had to take a few deep breaths to steady myself. I paid for my stuff and loaded everything into the car and sat in the driver's seat for a minute trying to calm down before I started the engine. The encounter bothered me more than I wanted to admit, and I kept replaying it in my head on the drive home. I realized Brenda's smear campaign was still working on some people who only heard her version of what happened. When I got home, Paul was playing with Lily on the living room floor, and he looked up and asked if I was okay, because I must have looked upset. I told him what happened at the store, and he put Lily in her playpen and came over to hug me. He said anyone who believed lies without asking our side of the story wasn't someone whose opinion mattered. I knew he was right, but it still stung that people in our community thought I was the villain in this situation. Paul reminded me that everyone who actually knew us and witnessed what happened at the church supported us completely. He said Brenda's friends who bought into her victim narrative without question were showing their own character, not ours. 2 days later, Hugo called Paul and said he'd signed a lease on a small apartment across town and was moving out of the house he'd shared with Brenda for 35 years. Paul put the phone on speaker so I could hear, and Hugo said he felt lighter than he had in years, just knowing he was getting out. He'd been documenting Brenda's behavior for the divorce proceedings, and his lawyer said the pattern of manipulation and control would help his case. Hugo told us he'd gone through old journals and emails and realized how much of his marriage had been Brenda controlling every aspect of their lives and punishing him when he didn't comply. Paul asked if his dad was really okay, and Hugo said he was better than okay because he was finally free. He said he'd spent decades walking on eggshells and second-guessing himself, and he didn't realize how exhausting it was until he stopped. Hugo told Paul he wished he'd left years ago and saved his kids from growing up in that environment. Paul got quiet, and I could see him processing that his whole childhood had been shaped by his mother's need for control. Paul started seeing Ingrid twice a week instead of once because he was working through a lot of complicated feelings about his mother. He came home from a session one afternoon and told me Ingrid was helping him process the grief of losing the mother-son relationship he'd always wanted, while accepting the reality of who Brenda actually was. I asked what that meant, and he said he'd spent his whole life hoping Brenda would change, or that he could somehow fix things between them if he just tried hard enough. Ingrid told him he was grieving something that never actually existed, because the loving, supportive mother he wanted was never who Brenda was capable of being. Paul said he was learning to mourn what never was, instead of continuing to hope she'd become someone different. He looked sad but also relieved, like he'd been carrying around this heavy weight, and finally got permission to put it down. I held his hand and told him I was proud of how much work he was putting into understanding himself and protecting our family. 2 months after the baptism, Gabriella called and invited us to Thanksgiving at her house. She said she wasn't inviting Brenda, and this would be the first major holiday where their mother were excluded from family gatherings. Paul asked if she was sure, and Gabriella said she was tired of pretending everything was fine, and she wanted a peaceful holiday without drama. She'd already talked to Hugo and Helen and several other family members, and everyone agreed they'd rather have Thanksgiving without Brenda's toxic presence. Paul looked at me, and I nodded because the idea of a holiday without worrying about what Brenda would say or do sounded amazing. Gabriella said it felt strange to plan a family gathering without their mother, but she was excited about having a celebration that was actually enjoyable instead of stressful. Paul told his sister we'd be there and asked what we could bring. After he hung up, he sat quiet for a minute and then said it was weird how relieved he felt about not seeing his mother on Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving morning, we drove to Gabriella's house with Lily in her car seat and a green bean casserole I'd made the night before. The house was full of people when we arrived, and everyone seemed relaxed and happy in a way I hadn't seen at family gatherings before. Hugo was already there helping Gabriella's husband set up extra chairs, and he smiled when he saw us walk in. He came over and asked if he could hold Lily, and I handed her to him. Hugo sat down in the living room with Lily on his lap and started talking to her in that silly voice people use with babies. I watched him bounce her gently and make faces at her, and suddenly his eyes got watery. He looked up at me and said he was so grateful to be part of her life and that he was sorry he didn't stand up to Brenda sooner. His voice cracked a little, and he said he'd spend the rest of his life making it right and being the grandfather Lily deserved. I told him he was already doing that, and Lily was lucky to have him. Paul sat down next to his dad and put his hand on his shoulder, and the three of them sat there together while the rest of the family moved around the house getting ready for dinner. Right before we sat down to eat, my phone buzzed with a text notification. I pulled it out and saw Brenda had sent a group message to the entire extended family. The text said she was spending Thanksgiving alone because her ungrateful children had abandoned her and turned the whole family against her. She wrote that she'd given her whole life to her family, and this was how they repaid her by excluding her from holiday celebrations. I showed the message to Paul, and he shook his head and put his phone face down on the table. Within minutes, other people's phones started buzzing, and I could see family members reading the text and looking annoyed. Helen picked up her phone and typed out a response telling Brenda to stop playing victim and take responsibility for her own actions. Paul's uncle sent a message saying Brenda had brought this on herself by demanding a paternity test at a baptism. Gabriella replied that their mother was welcome to join them when she genuinely apologized and stopped lying about what happened. I watched the group chat fill up with people telling Brenda she'd created this situation, and they weren't going to feel guilty about protecting themselves from her behavior. Brenda didn't respond to any of the messages. The next day, Paul got a private message from his cousin who lived in another state and hadn't been at the baptism. She said she'd heard about what happened and wanted Paul to know she'd experienced something similar with Brenda years ago when she married someone Brenda didn't approve of. Brenda had spent months trying to convince the family that the cousin's husband was wrong for her and spreading rumors about him being controlling and manipulative. The cousin said it was all projection because Brenda was the controlling one who couldn't handle not having input on the marriage. She told Paul that Brenda eventually moved on to a new target when she realized the family wasn't going to side with her. The cousin said the best thing she ever did was maintain firm boundaries and refuse to engage with Brenda's drama until she lost interest and found someone else to focus on. Paul thanked her for sharing that and said it helped to know other people had dealt with his mother's behavior and come out okay on the other side. I started feeling more confident in our decision as the weeks went by, and I saw how much healthier Paul was without his mother's constant manipulation. He was more present when he played with Lily, instead of being distracted by stress about what his mom might say or do next. He laughed more easily and didn't have that tense look on his face that he'd carried around for months. Our home felt peaceful without the ongoing drama of wondering when Brenda would show up or what new accusation she'd make. Paul told me one night after we put Lily to bed that he felt like he could finally breathe, and that he hadn't realized how much energy he'd been spending trying to manage his mother's feelings. I said I was proud of him for choosing our family, and he said it was the easiest choice he'd ever made once he stopped feeling guilty about it. 10 weeks passed, and I got a call from Hugo one Tuesday afternoon while I was feeding Lily her lunch. He sounded shaken and told me Brenda had just shown up at his apartment without warning. She'd been pounding on the door demanding he let her in so they could talk about the family situation. Hugo said he stood behind the locked door and told her through the wood that he wouldn't speak to her in person until she got professional help for whatever was making her act this way. She kept insisting she just wanted to explain her side and make him understand why she'd been so concerned about Lily's paternity. Hugo repeated that he'd only communicate through his lawyer from now on, and she needed to leave his property. Brenda apparently stood in the hallway for another 20 minutes, alternating between pleading and threatening before finally leaving. Hugo said he called building security to document the incident in case she tried coming back. I thanked him for telling us and asked if he was okay, and he admitted he was rattled because Brenda seemed more desperate than he'd ever seen her. Paul came home from work that evening, and I told him about his mother's visit to Hugo's place. He rubbed his face with both hands and said he'd been hoping the separation and consequences would make her reflect on her behavior, but instead she seemed to be spiraling further into desperation. The next few days brought more evidence of Brenda's increasing panic. Paul's cousin sent us screenshots of vague posts Brenda had started putting on social media about ungrateful children who abandon their parents after everything they've done for them. She wrote things like some people turn their backs on family when they need them most, and blood means nothing to certain individuals. She never named us directly, but anyone who knew about the baptism incident would understand exactly who she meant. Another relative forwarded us a post where Brenda talked about grandparents being denied access to innocent grandchildren because of manipulative people poisoning family relationships. The post kept coming over several days, and different family members kept sending them to us because they wanted us to see what Brenda was doing. Helen called Paul and said several relatives had commented on the post telling Brenda to stop playing victim and own up to what she'd actually done. A few of Brenda's church friends left sympathetic comments not knowing the full story, but most people who actually witnessed the baptism weren't buying her narrative. Paul looked at the screenshots and shook his head, saying his mother was making herself look worse with every post she made. I pointed out that Brenda seemed unable to accept that people had seen her behavior firsthand and weren't going to let her rewrite history. The public nature of her meltdown at the church meant she couldn't control the story the way she'd controlled things before, by whispering to people privately. We had a session scheduled with Ingrid the following week, and I brought up my concern about what would happen if Brenda ever did apologize. I told Ingrid I was worried we wouldn't know the difference between a genuine apology and a manipulative attempt to regain access to Lily. Ingrid pulled out a notepad and said we should create a clear plan for what genuine accountability would actually look like from Brenda. She asked us to think about what specific things Brenda would need to acknowledge and what actions she'd need to take beyond just saying sorry. Paul said Brenda would need to admit she was wrong to accuse me of infidelity and wrong to demand a paternity test at the baptism. I added that she'd need to acknowledge the harm she caused by spreading lies about me to the entire family for months. Ingrid wrote everything down and said Brenda would also need to take responsibility without making excuses or blaming anyone else for her behavior. We talked about what a non-apology sounds like with phrases like, "I'm sorry you felt hurt," or "I'm sorry if I offended you," that put responsibility on the other person instead of owning the action. Ingrid helped us understand that genuine remorse includes specific acknowledgement of harmful actions, plus understanding of the impact, plus commitment to change behavior. We agreed that if Brenda ever apologized, we'd need to see her working with a therapist consistently before we'd even consider supervised contact with Lily. Ingrid emphasized that we should reassess at every step and not rush into anything just because Brenda said the right words once. Paul seemed relieved to have a concrete framework for evaluating any future attempts at reconciliation, instead of just hoping we'd know what to do when the time came. 3 months after the baptism, Paul's phone rang while we were making dinner together. He looked at the screen and saw it was his mother calling. He let it go to voicemail and we continued cooking, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. After we ate, Paul listened to the message on speaker so I could hear it too. Brenda's voice sounded different from her previous angry messages. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking about what happened, and she wanted to talk to Paul about everything. She mentioned that she understood he was upset with her, and she wanted a chance to discuss things when he was ready. The message didn't include an actual apology or admission that she'd done anything wrong. She just kept saying she wanted to talk and work things out between them. Paul replayed the message twice, trying to figure out if there was genuine change in her tone, or if this was another manipulation tactic. I asked what he thought, and he said it sounded slightly more humble than her usual demanding attitude, but the lack of any actual apology was telling. He pointed out that she said she understood he was upset, not that she understood she'd done something hurtful. The focus was still on his feelings rather than her actions. We sat on the couch after putting Lily to bed, and Paul pulled out his phone to respond to his mother's voicemail. He typed out a text message while I watched and read it to me before sending. The message said he appreciated her reaching out, but they could only have a conversation when she was ready to genuinely apologize without excuses or justifications for her behavior. He wrote that demanding a paternity test at their daughter's baptism after months of spreading lies was deeply hurtful and damaging. He suggested she work with a therapist to understand why her actions were harmful and how to take real accountability. He ended by saying he loved her, but protecting his family had to come first. Paul read the message 3 times, making small edits before finally hitting send. He set his phone face down on the coffee table and leaned back against the couch cushions. I put my hand on his knee and told him the message was perfect, because it was honest and clear about what needed to happen. We both knew Brenda probably wouldn't respond well, but at least Paul had stated his boundaries clearly. Brenda's response came less than an hour later. Paul's phone buzzed and he picked it up to read the text message she'd sent back. Her message said she shouldn't need therapy just to see her own granddaughter, and we were being cruel by keeping Lily away from her. She wrote that she was Lily's grandmother and had rights to a relationship with her grandchild. The message accused us of punishing her and using Lily as a weapon to hurt her. She said real family forgives each other and moves forward instead of holding grudges forever. Paul read the message aloud, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. He said this was exactly what Ingrid had warned us about with the manipulation tactic of trying to make us feel guilty. Brenda was positioning herself as the victim being denied access to her grandchild, rather than acknowledging she'd destroyed the relationship through her own actions. Paul didn't respond to the message. He put his phone away and said responding would just invite more manipulation and guilt trips. I agreed and reminded him that Brenda's reaction proved she wasn't actually ready to take accountability. She wanted access to Lily without having to admit she'd done anything wrong or make any changes to her behavior. 2 days later, Gabriella called me in the afternoon sounding frustrated. She told me Brenda had shown up at her house that morning trying to use her as a messenger. Brenda asked Gabriella to convince Paul and me to be reasonable and let her see Lily. She'd apparently spent an hour telling Gabriella that she was being shut out of the family unfairly, and we were being too harsh by requiring therapy and apologies. Gabriella said she refused to carry any messages, and told their mother she completely supported our boundaries. She'd explained to Brenda that showing up at the baptism demanding a paternity test was unacceptable, and there would be consequences for that behavior. Brenda had gotten angry and accused Gabriella of choosing me over her own mother. Gabriella told her it wasn't about choosing sides, but about supporting what was right and protecting Lily from toxic behavior. She said Brenda left her house upset, but Gabriella felt good about standing firm. I thanked her for not letting Brenda manipulate her into being a go-between, and told her how much it meant that she was supporting our decisions. Gabriella said watching her mother's behavior over the past months had opened her eyes to patterns she'd been excusing her whole life. She told me she was proud of Paul for setting boundaries and protecting his family, even though she knew it was hard for him. The holidays were approaching, and Paul and I started making plans that deliberately didn't include Brenda. We decided to host Thanksgiving at our house and invite Hugo, Gabriella and her family, Helen, and my parents. Paul admitted one evening while we were looking at recipes that he felt sad about his mother not being part of the holiday, but also relieved we wouldn't have to deal with her drama. He said it should be a joyful time celebrating with Lily, and he didn't want it ruined by Brenda's accusations and manipulation. I told him it was okay to feel both sadness and relief at the same time. The grief over losing the mother he wished he had could exist alongside the peace that came from protecting our family. Paul said therapy was helping him understand that he could love his mother, while still maintaining distance from her toxic behavior. He didn't have to choose between caring about her and keeping Lily safe. We finished planning the menu and sent out invitations to everyone we wanted at our table, knowing this holiday would look different from any we'd had before. But maybe that was exactly what we needed. Hugo met Paul for coffee on a Saturday morning a few weeks before Thanksgiving. When Paul came home, he told me his dad had shared that he'd been attending a support group for people divorcing partners with narcissistic traits. Hugo had found the group online and started going to weekly meetings where people shared their experiences dealing with manipulation and control in their relationships. Paul said his dad seemed lighter and more confident than he'd been in years. Hugo had told him the group helped him recognize patterns in his marriage that he'd normalized over decades. He encouraged Paul to keep prioritizing his immediate family and not feel guilty about protecting Lily from Brenda's toxicity. Hugo said he wished he'd set boundaries with Brenda years ago instead of enabling her behavior by making excuses and trying to keep peace. He told Paul that watching him stand up for his wife and daughter made him proud, and he should never doubt that he was doing the right thing. Paul seemed moved by his father's support and said it meant everything to have Hugo fully in their corner after years of him trying to mediate between Brenda and everyone else. 4 months after the baptism, Helen called with news about Brenda. She told us Brenda had apparently started seeing a therapist and had mentioned it to a few family members. Helen said she wasn't sure if Brenda was genuinely working on herself or just going through the motions to check a box, so she could claim she'd done what we asked. She'd heard from another relative that Brenda was telling people she was in therapy to deal with the trauma of being cut off from her family. Helen pointed out that Brenda was still framing herself as the victim, rather than someone working to understand her harmful behavior. We told Helen we appreciated the update, but we'd need to see actual changes in how Brenda acted before we'd believe the therapy was making any difference. Paul said his mother was capable of performing change without actually changing if she thought it would get her what she wanted. I agreed and said we'd wait to see if Brenda's behavior shifted over time rather than taking her word that she was doing the work. Helen understood and said she'd keep us informed if she heard anything else, but she supported us being cautious about believing Brenda's therapy claims without evidence of real growth. Lily's 6-month birthday party filled our backyard with people who truly loved her. Hugo held her while she grabbed at his glasses, and everyone laughed at the way she squealed when Gabriella's kids sang to her. Helen brought a cake decorated with butterflies, and my parents set up a banner that said, "Happy Half-Birthday Princess." Paul stood next to me watching our daughter surrounded by family and squeezed my hand. The photos from that afternoon showed Lily grinning with frosting on her face and reaching for Hugo's blue eyes that matched hers perfectly. Looking through the pictures later that night after everyone left, I felt this deep sense of peace knowing our family was built on genuine love instead of Brenda's poison. We'd created something real and healthy by refusing to let her toxicity infect our home. Paul said he felt grateful we'd stood our ground, even though it meant losing his mother because protecting Lily mattered more than keeping peace with someone who refused to acknowledge her own granddaughter. 2 weeks after the party, Helen called saying Brenda had given her a letter to pass along to us. Helen warned us before we even opened it that she'd read it and didn't think it was a real apology. Paul opened the envelope at our kitchen table and started reading out loud. The letter began with Brenda saying she'd been thinking about everything that happened and she wanted to reach out. Then came phrases like, "I'm sorry you felt hurt by my concerns," and "I was only trying to protect Paul from potential deception." She wrote that she understood we were upset, but she hoped we could see she'd acted out of love for her son. The whole thing was filled with excuses about why she'd had legitimate reasons to question Lily's paternity. She mentioned her own mother's intuition and how she couldn't ignore what her heart was telling her. Near the end, she wrote that she missed her son and hoped we could move past this misunderstanding so she could be part of Lily's life. Paul finished reading and set the letter down. His jaw was tight, and I could see him processing how his mother still didn't understand what she'd done wrong. Paul spent the next day writing his response. He sat at his laptop for hours, typing and deleting and retyping until he had exactly what he wanted to say. When he showed me the email he'd written, it was clear and direct without being cruel. He explained that her letter wasn't a real apology because she hadn't acknowledged what she actually did wrong. He wrote that saying, "I'm sorry you felt hurt," wasn't the same as saying, "I was wrong to accuse Amanda of infidelity," and demand a paternity test at our daughter's baptism. He listed specific things she'd done starting from the day Lily was born and explained how each action had damaged their relationship. He told her that real accountability meant admitting she was wrong and understanding why her behavior was harmful, not just expressing regret that we were upset about it. He ended by stating clearly that until she could genuinely apologize without excuses or justifications, there was no path forward for any relationship. Paul read the email 3 times before sending it and asked if I thought it was too harsh. I told him it was honest and necessary, and she needed to hear the truth even if she wouldn't accept it. We had a session with Ingrid the following week and brought up Brenda's letter. Ingrid read through it and nodded like she'd seen this exact pattern before. She explained that people with narcissistic traits often struggle with genuine apologies because admitting fault threatens their self-image. Brenda's letter was a perfect example of a non-apology that placed responsibility on our feelings rather than her actions. Ingrid reminded us that we couldn't force someone to have genuine remorse or self-awareness. She said some people were simply incapable of the kind of honest self-reflection required for real change. We talked about our disappointment and how part of us had hoped Brenda would surprise us with actual accountability. Ingrid validated that it was normal to feel let down, but reinforced that we were making the right choice by maintaining our boundaries. She pointed out that accepting a fake apology just to restore the relationship would teach Brenda that she could manipulate her way back without doing real work. Paul admitted he felt relieved in a way because Brenda's inadequate apology made our decision easier. There was no gray area to navigate when she so clearly demonstrated she still didn't understand what she'd done wrong. 5 months after the baptism, Gabriella called with news that she was pregnant with her third child. Paul was thrilled for his sister, and we celebrated over dinner at their house that weekend. 3 days later, Gabriella called again, but this time she sounded frustrated. Brenda had somehow found out about the pregnancy, and immediately called asking if this meant she'd get to be involved as a grandmother. Gabriella said their mother had acted like the new baby was her ticket back into the family. Brenda had asked if Gabriella would bring the baby to visit her, and whether she'd be invited to the hospital when the baby was born. She'd talked about how she'd been punished long enough, and surely this fresh start meant everyone could move forward. Gabriella told us she'd felt sick listening to their mother try to use her unborn child as leverage. Brenda hadn't asked how Gabriella was feeling or expressed genuine excitement about becoming a grandmother again. She'd only focused on what this pregnancy meant for her own access to the family. Gabriella handled the situation better than I expected. She told Brenda directly that her relationship with this new grandchild would depend entirely on whether she could genuinely apologize and change her behavior toward Paul's family. She explained that she wouldn't allow her child to grow up watching their grandmother treat their cousin Lily as less than. Gabriella said she'd support whatever boundaries Paul and I needed, and she wouldn't be manipulated into giving Brenda access through her kids. Brenda had reacted badly, according to Gabriella. She'd started crying and saying her own daughter was betraying her. She'd accused Gabriella of choosing me over her own mother, and claimed Paul had brainwashed his whole family against her. Gabriella had stayed calm and repeated that the choice was Brenda's to make. She could do the hard work of genuine accountability, or she could continue being excluded from family events. Then she'd ended the call before Brenda could guilt-trip her further. Paul told his sister he was proud of her for setting clear boundaries and not falling for their mother's manipulation. The extended family's support continued to surprise me over the following weeks. Paul's cousin reached out to share that Brenda had tried similar control tactics when she'd gotten engaged years ago. Helen's daughter told me about a time Brenda had spread rumors about her parenting choices. Hugo's brother called to say he'd always known Brenda had issues, but her public meltdown at the baptism had given everyone permission to stop pretending everything was fine. I started hearing story after story about Brenda's controlling and hurtful behavior going back decades. People shared incidents they'd previously excused or minimized because they didn't want to cause family drama. The baptism had been such a shocking public display that it broke through everyone's tendency to make excuses for her. Paul's aunt mentioned that Brenda had always needed to be the center of attention and couldn't handle when other people's lives didn't revolve around her needs. A family friend admitted she'd stopped inviting Brenda to gatherings years ago because she always found ways to make herself the victim. I felt validated hearing these stories because it confirmed we weren't overreacting or being too harsh. Brenda's behavior toward us fit a lifelong pattern that multiple people had witnessed and suffered from. Paul came home from work one evening and found me feeding Lily in the nursery. He sat down in the rocking chair and watched us for a minute before speaking. He told me he'd been thinking about everything with his mother, and he'd finally reached a place of peace about it. He said he loved Brenda and probably always would because she was his mother, but he'd accepted that she might never be capable of the self-reflection and change necessary for a healthy relationship. He'd spent months hoping she'd have some breakthrough moment where she'd realize what she'd done and genuinely apologize. Now he understood that waiting for her to change was giving her power over our happiness. He'd decided to focus on the family we'd built instead of mourning the mother he wished he had. Paul said protecting Lily came first, and he was okay with whatever that meant for his relationship with Brenda. He looked at our daughter and said she deserved to grow up surrounded by people who cherished her, not someone who'd spent her first 6 months denying her existence. I told him I was proud of how far he'd come, and grateful he'd chosen us over trying to keep peace with his mother. 6 months after the baptism, a certified letter arrived from a law office we didn't recognize. Paul opened it at the kitchen counter and his face went pale as he read. The letter was from Brenda's lawyer threatening legal action regarding grandparents' rights. It claimed Brenda had been unjustly denied access to her granddaughter, and cited some state law about grandparents being entitled to visitation. The letter demanded we establish a regular visitation schedule or face a court petition. Paul immediately forwarded the letter to a family law attorney that Hugo had recommended. The attorney called us back within 2 hours and told us not to worry. She explained that given Brenda's behavior at the baptism and her complete lack of an established relationship with Lily, she had no legal standing for grandparents' rights in our state. She said the threatening letter was likely just Brenda's attempt to intimidate us into backing down. The attorney assured us she'd handle everything, and we should continue maintaining our boundaries. The legal threat actually made things clearer for both of us. It showed that Brenda still saw this as a power struggle she could win, rather than understanding she'd destroyed the relationship through her own actions. She wasn't trying to repair the damage or earn back trust. She was trying to force her way back into our lives through legal intimidation. Paul worked with our attorney to send a formal cease and desist letter back to Brenda's lawyer. The letter detailed Brenda's behavior starting from Lily's birth through the baptism incident and made it clear we'd fight any legal action she attempted. It stated that Brenda had no established relationship with Lily to preserve, and her own actions had caused the estrangement. Our attorney included witness statements from people who'd been at the baptism and copies of the horrible voicemails Brenda had left. Paul signed the letter and told me he felt relieved to have everything documented. He said if his mother wanted to make this a legal battle, then we'd show a judge exactly who she was and what she'd done. We heard nothing from Brenda's lawyer after that, and our attorney confirmed the threat had been dropped. Hugo called Paul a few weeks later with news that his divorce had been finalized. He came over that evening and sat at our kitchen table looking lighter than I'd seen him in years. He told Paul he should have left Brenda decades ago, but he'd convinced himself staying was the right thing for the kids. Now he understood that watching their mother's toxic behavior had probably hurt Paul and Gabriella more than a divorce would have. Hugo had started dating someone he met through a friend at work. Her name was Julia, and she treated him with basic respect and kindness, which seemed revolutionary after 35 years with Brenda. He pulled out his phone and showed us photos of himself and Julia at a coffee shop, both of them smiling genuinely. Paul looked at the pictures and told his father he was happy for him. Hugo asked if he could hold Lily, and I handed her over. He sat there rocking her gently and told us he wanted to build a real relationship with his granddaughter, based on love, not control, or manipulation. He'd missed so much of her first 6 months being caught up in Brenda's drama, and he didn't want to waste any more time. Watching him with Lily made me realize how different things could have been if he'd stood up to Brenda from the beginning, but I was grateful he'd finally found his way to us. Lily's first birthday approached faster than I expected. Paul and I started planning a celebration and made a deliberate choice about the guest list. We invited everyone who'd supported us through the nightmare with Brenda, and specifically excluded anyone who'd taken her side or stayed neutral. The party was at our house on a Saturday afternoon in early spring. My parents arrived first and helped set up decorations in the backyard. Hugo came with Julia, and I watched Paul greet her warmly, which felt like another sign of how far we'd all come. Aunt Helen brought her whole family, including her daughter with the dimples that matched Lily's. Gabriella arrived with her kids and her husband, and immediately started helping in the kitchen. Even Bryson showed up with a giant stuffed animal that was probably too advanced for a 1-year-old, but Lily seemed fascinated by it anyway. The backyard filled with laughter and conversation, and I stood at the kitchen window watching everyone interact. These were the people who'd chosen to stand by us when it would have been easier to stay out of it, or believe Brenda's lies. Paul came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. He said it was a beautiful day, and he was grateful for every person out there. I leaned back against him and felt the truth of that. We'd built something real and solid despite Brenda's attempts to destroy our family before it even started. That night, after everyone left and Lily was asleep, Paul and I sat on the couch surrounded by birthday wrapping paper and leftover cake. We started talking about everything that had happened since the baptism almost a year ago. Paul said the whole nightmare had been traumatic, and he wouldn't wish it on anyone, but it had also clarified things in a way nothing else could have. We'd learned who actually cared about us versus who just wanted to avoid conflict or maintain appearances. The baptism incident had forced us to set boundaries we probably should have established earlier, and it taught us we didn't need to feel guilty about protecting our daughter. I told him I agreed, and added that I'd learned I was stronger than I thought. Standing up to Brenda in front of that whole congregation had terrified me, but doing it showed me I could handle whatever came next. Paul said watching me hold our ground while his mother attacked had made him realize he needed to be equally strong. He'd spent too many years trying to manage his mother's feelings, and it had nearly cost him his marriage and relationship with his daughter. Now he understood that prioritizing Lily's well-being wasn't selfish or cruel, even if it meant his mother faced consequences for her behavior. We sat there in the quiet house, and I felt grateful for how far we'd come together. Our marriage had been tested in ways I never anticipated, but we'd come through it more solid than before. A few weeks after the birthday party, I was playing with Lily on the living room floor when Hugo arrived for his weekly visit. He'd gotten into a routine of coming over every Sunday afternoon to spend time with his granddaughter. Julia came with him sometimes, but today it was just Hugo. He sat down on the floor with us, and Lily immediately crawled over to him, reaching for his glasses like she always did. He laughed and gently redirected her hands to a toy instead. I watched them play together and thought about how different this was from what I'd imagined a year ago. When I was pregnant, I'd pictured both of Paul's parents being involved grandparents who'd love Lily unconditionally. Instead, we had Hugo building a genuine relationship with her, while Brenda remained completely absent by her own choice. But looking at Hugo's face as Lily babbled at him, I realized this was actually better. Lily was surrounded by people who'd chosen to be in her life, not people who felt obligated or who attached conditions to their love. She'd grow up knowing her grandfather Hugo as someone who'd stood up for her and her parents when it mattered. She'd be loved by aunts and uncles and cousins who'd proven their loyalty. Our family looked nothing like I'd imagined, but it was healthier and happier. Paul came in from the kitchen and joined us on the floor. The three of us sat there with Lily in the middle, and I felt genuinely grateful we'd stood our ground even when it was hard. We'd protected our daughter and built the family she deserved.